Welcome back to our final session this afternoon, and we have three speakers: Professor Paula Barata Dias, Professor Carlota Miranda Urbano, and Professor Ana Paula Arnaud. So we're carrying on with this idea that the Gospels inspired and appealed to poets and to writers in different centuries and in different languages. We heard about rewritten Gospels in Latin and in Greek this morning. Now we're going to hear about a bit of Greek and Latin as well. And Professor Ana Paula Arnaud, who's going to close the whole thing, and the cherry on top of the cake, as people say, will talk to us of our great Portuguese writer, José Saramago, who also wrote a Gospel in Portuguese. So we're going to start with Professor Paula Barata Dias. Professor Paula Barata Dias is the director of our Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures here at the Faculdade de Letras of the University of Coimbra. She's an associate professor with aggregation title, and she's a specialist in late antiquity, both Latin texts and Greek texts, and she's also a specialist on monastic literature. And she's going to talk to us about the Christos Paschon, a very interesting text which we are all wishing to discover. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, my dear colleague Frederico. I want also to say thanks to Lautaro Lazulota, our professor visiting professor here at our faculty, for having invited me for this conference. Well, I should apologize for my sometimes mismeanings in English. I am not that doable in English than in other foreign languages, but I will make an effort, and this is also a pedagogical experience that we should face. Thank you for being my guinea pigs. Well, of course, I already talked in English, but it's always a divide. Well, the Christos Paschon trilogy, attributed by literary tradition to Gregory of Nazianzus, is a cento of 2,602 iambic verses about the Passion of Christ, composed on the basis of Euripides' tragedies. Half of these verses come from 7 Euripidean works: Hecuba, Orestes, Hippolytus, Medea, Trojans, Bacchae, and the late fragmentary work Rhesus, associated with the Euripidean corpus. Occasionally, verses from other compositions, almost 1/4, are present, such as Alcestis, Andromache, Helen, Iphigenia in Aulid, Iphigenia among the Tauri, and Phoenicians. The text of this Christian appropriation can be divided into types. Firstly, the direct quotations from the Gospels relating to the steps in the narrative of Christ's Passion, meaning arrest and death, deposition in the tomb, and resurrection, give the main structure of this triptych. Secondly, we can have a creative and original hermeneutic, which discusses, argues, and exposes and tests theological questions that are part of the frequent Christological and Mariological debate in the religious, spiritual, but also ecclesiastical environment of the Roman Empire, particularly in this 4th, 5th century in its eastern half. It is in this type of drama that Euripides' repertoire intervenes, consistently with exact quotations of Euripidean mixed and fragmented parts of its work. Well, in the first slide, I put a sort of resume of my communication. I want now to talk a little more about the characteristics of the Christos Paschon. After that, I hope to talk a little bit about questions, problematic of the authorship of Gregorius of Nazianzus, and finally the relationship with Euripides' work. This work is organized around 3 episodes that follow one another, meaning the Passion and Death of Christ. After that, Christ in the tomb and the resurrection of Christ, the third part. In other words, the 3 days that the Gospels dedicate to the mystery of redemption through the Passion, Death, and Resurrection of Christ. Well, as you can see in the, well, I will skip a little, we will come back. Well, these 3 episodes are also present in the iconographic art. It's consecrated in the West, in the Christian art. In these triptychs, only for you to verify that this separation, these 3 different steps, meaning arrest and after that crucifixion, deposition in the tomb, and resurrection, 3 different moments. Well, I'll go back. Sorry. The main character of this tragedy is Mary, the Mother of God, Theotokos, who alternates speaking with the choir of pious women who accompanied Christ's passion and death, and with the messengers who fulfilled the important function of maintaining the dynamic of structural narrative. They are the ones who update the information of the episodes and stages of the Passion in a counterpoint which elusive and responsive, but also rational Mary responses. Who is the dramatic protagonist? This role belongs to Mary. Although her gaze and words focus on a point to the figure of her son in his sacrificial act, in a sequence of events that was foreseen in the scriptures and that Jesus accepted as part of the plan for the redemption, it is Mary who we see exposed, shredded and transformed through the drama. Mary, as a human being and tragic character, is the only one on stage who has a biological carnal bond with Jesus, who will be crucified and who will arise again. As a human being, Mary fears and trembles for the fragility and mortality of her son. Let's remember that as the woman chosen to welcome the Son of God into her womb, the gospel testimonies about Mary and what she really knew about the mystery of her son are quite scarce. The Gospels gives us the image of a generous young woman who accepts what is happening in her without always understanding it. For instance, the episode of an adolescent Jesus fleeing to the temple when he was, a young boy, she we can verify that maybe she's not understanding what is really happening to her son, although she has premonitions and some previous senses about it. For instance, at the wedding of Cana, it is she who tells servants to do whatever he tells you. She, however, is the figure who remains with the other woman and also with the adolescent John. That is, women, including Mary and John, belong to social groups that can be classified as minor importance and even excluded from social value and from juridical responsibility. That's why they can be there. The other apostles were adults that were, they were possible to be responsibilized. They had to flee. With Christ, we have the woman and a very young John. Nobody cares what they are doing there. Therefore, the dramatic language gives more primacy to the narrated than to the represented, to the extent that the spectator learns about the main events in deference to the real moment, watching the dialogue between the informer, the witnesses to the Paschon episodes, the messengers, and Mary, who receives, comments, replies, and interprets in a movement that, in that play, is already exegetical. In the play, Mary mourns the fate of her son, but she is the first to reveal and externalize the greater meaning and purpose of Jesus' sacrifice, and on this level to overcome the wickedness and catastrophe of the annihilation of the flesh she gave birth to as a mother. While mourning and suffering the loss, she integrates it into the greater purpose of the economy of salvation. At this level, Mary really stands out as the first of Christ's human followers, the one who would have, in a way, dispensed gladly the descent of the Holy Spirit in order to fully understand the mystery of salvation. She is, amidst her limitations of knowledge as a human being, in fact, the forerunner, just as she had been by intuition at the wedding of Cana, when she exhorted the servants to obey her son, to do everything he said. Mary's presence in early Christianity is, in fact, relatively discreet, accompanying the very few but significant moments in which she is given a direct voice or direct speech in the Gospels, meaning 4 times in the Gospel of Luke and 2 times at the wedding of Cana in John's Gospel. Although the object of popular devotion as a female figure, mother and wife, to whom the attributes of female divinities from Greek religiosity were transferred, the deepening and reflection on Mary's identity and place in Christianity followed the Christological controversies on the 4th century. In this way, the disputes about the nature of Jesus, changing in many degrees between the only human, the only divine, and equal proportions between humanity and divinity, or the equality and co-presence in the same person of the 2 divine and human natures, were the subject of heated and erudite discussions that shaped Christian identity and its doctrinal and theological body. The dates of First Council of Nicaea, 325, the First Council of Constantinople, 385, and at last, the Council of Ephesus at 434, I think. During the controversies about the nature of Jesus Christ. However, a gap during these first councils, Nicaea and Constantinople, a gap remained unresolvable, but also discrete. The testimony and place of Mary, the only human being with a relationship of biological kinship with Jesus, which means at least the testimony of his human nature, at least. A maternal figure, as were also the human beings who gestated the children of Zeus, for instance, Alcmena or Leda, that were also human, human females that were also brought also the son of gods to the world. The nature, value, and protagonism of women, as is well known, were not treated with much attention or care by the classics, bound by a series of conventions and prejudices that devalued their social place, autonomy, equal intelligence, capacity for choice, and discernment. In many ways, women were marginalized and also invisible. But in ancient Greek and Latin culture, we come to a moment when the condition of the central figure of a religious movement is defined as divine, but also entirely human. Mary is thus brought into the light and into a role that is not concealable, since she, as well as being the mother of Jesus, is not only the witness to his full humanity, but also the guardian and the main interpreter in this play of the mystery that was the incarnation, in Greek, in Sarkeia. That means the God that the God that became flesh, that gained materiality, first in her womb and then among men. The Council of Ephesus, in which the term Theotokos, Dei Para, Mother of God, was used for the Virgin Mary, as opposed to the ancient definition of Christotokos, Mother of the divinized substance of Christ, was decisive, since accepting the later proposition meant once again admitting a different time for the divinization of human flesh, and therefore for the unevenness of Christ's two natures, human and divine. It could be said that through the exaltation of the Mother, the Son and his everlasting holiness is elevated. How much time do I have?
We still have almost 15 minutes.
Okay.
So we can do the questions as we did this morning. We could have the questions after Professor Paula, Professor Carlota.
Okay,
Professor
okay.
Paula,
No, it's only to...
Then we do all the questions here.
Well, now I want to illustrate a little, to show you just a small pieces of this curious play, where we can find Euripides' work that in a dismantled way, articulated in a syntax that is unique to the communication of Christian mystery from the experience and testimony of Mary Theotokos. But in this case, of course, we can talk about fragmented pieces of Euripidean plays, but we have also a semantic and symbolic transfers, meaning parallels between Christian characters and tragic characters. Resuming, if Eve is said as, when this play talks about Eve, verses of Medea are being used, as we will see in some moments. Mary is presented as Ekuba. God the Father appears with the words used by Helios when he saves Medea. Christ is said to use, Christ never speaks in the play. All the direct speech, we don't have direct, Christ's direct speech, is always someone who tells what Christ is saying. So, in his words, he appears as Dionysus, who meekly allows himself to be captured, as it happened in Bacchae. Judas uses the words of Theseus. Paris appears as the devil. Paris, that is present on Helen, appears as the devil in Christos Paschon. Only some pieces of illustration about the changements between, or to use that the Euripidean use in the play Theotokos. For instance, when explaining the mystery or the event of arrestment and mistreats of Jesus, it's Mary who explains the problem of wickedness of the human race with fault of Eve, first fault of Eve. Under the weight of misfortune, the unhappy woman knows all that is gained by not abandoning the blessed home of the Father. She abhors his generation, and she finds no happiness from seeing it. Well, at this moment, the Christos Paschon is using the words said by the nurse when she speaks about the misfortune Medea, distressed with Jason's betrayal and rejection, that finds no happiness in seeing her children. In another moment, when the messenger tells to Mary Jesus' monologue in the Garden of Olives, well, the messenger brings the words of Jesus, and Jesus said, "Father, prepare me now to the greatest of glories, while always keeping the glory I have always had at your side. I will achieve a new one by crushing the enemy of mankind." Well, this is exactly, with some variances, but not very much, in fact, the words of Dionysus in Bacchae. Also, he says, "When I have taken upon myself the burden of all humanity, and when I have suffered the torment of the cross for its redemption, I will return to your hands." In fact, we have a big proximity between the figure of Christ and the figure of Dionysus in Bacchae. Also, in the moment of sacrifice, at last, in the moment of the second part of the play, we have the verses, "Oh, you whom my actions have glorified, invite your friends to the feast. Blessed are you for being the author of these words." Well, these words, put in the mouth of Jesus, were said by Agave in the Exodus of Bacchae, when she addresses to Cadmus in delirium, with the head of Pentheus in her hands, urging her father to be proud of his deeds and to prepare a banquet to celebrate it. So there's something a little difficult and also to shocking Because we have, for instance, Medea, Bacchae. What kind of mothers are these? These are not exactly mothers that, of course, we have here mothers that have lost their childs, but in a special context. These are mothers that lost her child in the context of filicide. They killed their child. And it's quite interesting to have this particular place, Bacchae and Medea, to put it or used to explain the psychological position of Mary inside Christos Paschon. We are dealing with what? Of course, Mary didn't have responsibilities in the dying of his son, but somehow it's an explained death. It's a death that has a meaning and a purpose. So, of course, it's not a matter of playing, of gaming with different verses. There is a connection in sense, meaning that we have from Euripidean tradition recovery of mothers, of course, mothers that killed their sons, but somehow to reconfigure the image of Mary, but somehow mothers that overcome that process, integrated this violence in a bigger context. Well, we have other examples of this textual comparison, but I will skip it to speak a little more. I think I don't have already time to talk about attribution of 5 minutes. Okay. About the complexity of the attribution of this work. Sorry. About the problematic of attribution of Gregorius of Nazianzus. Well, I will resume this topic. The first to discuss the authorship of the work placed it in the same time and space of the 4th century at the political challenge to Julian the Apostate, led by the Christian intellectual leadership with the theological controversies arising from the Arianistic quarrel. The authorship of the theologian Gregorius of Nazianzus was not really questioned by the manuscript testimonies and by the first editors of the work, as far as the studies on the vast and profound work of Gregory of Nazianzus progressed. An internal argument was imposed, but in a way that we can perceive a sort of prejudice. For instance, we have the Jesuit Antoine Poussevan at 17th century, who says that the sentence of Euripides was unworthy of Gregorius of Nazianzus due to incompatibilities between the style employed and the work of Nazianzus. We also quote, here you have it, Renan de Thioumont, who said that many authors, both Catholic and heretics, do not see the style or gravitas of St. Gregory's in this tragedy. Even the editors of Teubner from at the end of the 19th century published this work as Tragoedia Christiana, and during the most part of modern and contemporary age, this text was presented as an exercise, a late Byzantine exercise. Last research verified the presence of segments of Christos Paschon in Byzantine and earlier Byzantine authors such as Romano Melodius, John Damascene, and John Mauropoulos, which is a strong support to the thesis of the ancientity of this work. We have also the main arguments that, yes. Well, when, and it was Tullier, yes, the late editor of this text, Tullier demonstrated that, considers that insufficient accord about the authorship of the Errores of Nazianzus must be combined with the fact that the quality of the Euripidean text present in the work corresponds to the very ancient versions of it, a demonstration that proves the ancientity to the drama. We have also minuto. Okay. Well, I will not continue to discuss the authorship. Well, I will only say that we think that is a work of late 4th or 5th century, even if it doesn't belong to Gregory of Nazianzus, is someone who is connected to his cultural context. Well, why Euripides? This is what I want to highlight. Recovering Euripides' poetry for a catechetical purpose is a plausible reaction by a cultivated Christianity to the restriction imposed by Julian when he tried to prohibit the presence of Christians in general schools. In this sense, can we really talk about a recovery of Euripides at this moment, or does it make more sense to consider that he was always there? He never went away in Hellenistic idea. In fact, we can talk about the abundance of repertoire, meaning considering Euripides. The argument of the solidity of Euripides' repertoire, well known, influential, and renewing the literary forms of post-Alexandrian Hellenism, with an impact on the narrative structure and thematic choice of both the Greek novel, new tragic forms, and even in Commedia Nova. Euripides was, among the tragediographers, the most copied and read of the authors on Hellenistic and Greek or Roman idea. When we think about Christianizing Euripides, we must think that after Homer and Plato, joined a little after by the Latin Virgil, Euripides was the most quoted Greek author in Christian patristics until the 5th century, making him a reference point for its golden age. Yes, I will go through the conclusions. Euripides is quoted for criticizing him, but also in moments that he is appreciated and considered as a good example for Christian idea. Well, sorry, I will finish.
You can save the rest for
the publication, maybe. Well, thank you for hearing me. I hope.
Thank you, Professor Paula Barata-Dias. And we now have our next speaker, Professor Carlota Miranda-Urbano. Professor Carlota Miranda-Urbano is a professor of Latin and Latin literature here at the University of Coimbra. He's a specialist on 16th and 17th century Latin, and she's also a specialist on epic recreations of Latin poetry on Christian subjects. She's also a specialist in Jesuit studies, but today she's going to talk about something which is different from Jesuit studies, and it's not from the 17th century, but she's going to talk to us about Sedulius and his Paschale. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to thank the Professor Frederico for inviting me back to Sedulius and Paschale Carmen, because in fact, while I was preparing my PhD in Neo-Latin literature, Portuguese humanists from the 16th and 17th century present me Sedulius, Sedulius and other epic Christians, and that was a surprise for me. I later understood why, because in some way the idea that late antiquity was a period of literary decline was still present then. However, that attitude towards late antiquity had been changing, and I met these these innovative works in the 80s of the past century. By Michael Roberts and Karl Springer, and my interest in Christian epic poets of late antiquity would have to be put on hold, except for some attention devoted to Juvencus and Prudentius in a classical tradition seminar. Thanks to Frederico now, I returned to Sedulius, and that allowed me to verify that in meantime those studies had borne fruit. In the case of Sedulius, we have now a study and a translation, English translation of Karl Springer, that mentions in his preface a number of researchers who, his own way or another, engaged in dialogue with him, and whose studies and reviews were decisive for his work. He recalls, among others, Roger Green and his monograph, Latin Epics of the New Testament. For an up-to-date and comprehensive overview of what is known about Sedulius, the reception of the Paschale Carmen and its lecture through the centuries in curricula, we refer to this work by Springer. But let us focus on Sedulius and the Paschale Carmen. Roger Green devotes a chapter for his work to the question, who is Sedulius? Well, the answer is not easy. The most reliable biographical data we have is taken either from dedicatory letters written by the poet himself or from manuscripts of his work with some further information. Most documents refer to the poet simply as Sedulius, although some refer to him as Callius or Coelius or Cecilius Sedulius. Some refer to him as a layman who studied philosophy or who was a grammar teacher, while others refer to him as a clergyman or even a bishop. This disparity is not surprising, as the classical tone of the language, the theological depth and biblical exegesis underlying the Paschale Carmen suggests that the author was well educated not only in classical literature, but also had a great familiarity with the biblical text, its exegesis and Christian theology, qualities expected of a clergyman who dedicated his life to study. And I pass other subjects. But regardless of the accuracy of uncertainties surrounding Sedulius' biography, we can examine the poem and introduce its lecture. That's what I will do, from the perspective of a classicist. What is the message of Paschale Carmen? It is no coincidence that this title focuses on the Christian charisma, the proclamation of the paschal mystery of Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection to redeem humanity. This is what the adjective Paschale means, and this is the main focus on the epic Carmen, to celebrate, to narrate this absolutely extraordinary event. This is what is expected of an epic poem in antiquity, the narrative of something extraordinary accomplished by a hero, a human being with divine ancestry, but subject or submitted to death, who faces an agon, who suffers, but who, through his intelligence or strength, through his physical or moral virtue, triumphs, not without the help of the Olympian gods who protect him, nor without the opposition of those who are hostile to him. The epic, therefore, always unfolds in a hybrid setting, where two narrative planes intersect, the human one and the divine one. We have no doubt about Sedulius' intention to inscribe Paschale Carmen in the epic tradition. Sedulius wants to write the epic of Christ. To accomplish this goal, he does not limit himself choosing dactylic hexameter. He takes the ancient epic as a model of imitatio, but clearly rivaling it. The poem is preceded by a highly symbolic preface that prepares the reader to this new epic journey. Sedulius presents his reading of poetry as a meal, a catering, a banquet. The reader is the conviva. Poetry is a meal or Easter food, Paschales, dapes. And the poet warns his companion with who is sharing the meal that he will not find great riches or literary artifice there, but rather a modest table, more for the joy of the soul than to satisfy hunger. A meal that the poet did not prepare in golden vessels with all the fruits of sea, earth, and sky, but only a few vegetables from a poor garden served in a clay pot. In the original De Paupere Ordo, evoking verses, of course, and rubra testa. Readers familiar with classical epic poetry immediately recall the theme of banquets, convivial hospitality, and the singing of bards. But Christian readers educated in classical epic poetry also recall the biblical theme of the Passover meal, the motives of evangelic simplicity and poverty, and even that of human dignity and fragility, recalled in Paul's image of the clay vessel that carries a treasure. Above all, the words which opens the preface, Paschales dapes, refers the Christian reader to banquets of paschal sacrifice par excellence, in which the sacrificial victim is God himself, the obedient lamb, opposed to the banquets of sacrifices offered to pagan gods. This poem is a meal, a powerful image in Christian charisma, for the death and resurrection of Christ is renewed at every Eucharistic meal, the sacrifice in which God gives himself to be eaten. The first verses of the book 1 continue on this vein, stressing the break between Sedulius verses and pagan poetry, although it does not dispense it in order to assert itself as both poetry and epic, thus continuing in its tradition. Let us read what he begins by stating and how he does so in the first verses, in a registers of emulatio. Since pagan poets, and I'm doing a paraphrase, since pagan poets using grandiloquent literary devices strive to flaunt their inventions, renewing cruelties by singing of heinous crimes, multiplying and perpetuating old lies, why should Sedulius himself, accustomed to singing the Psalms of David with serene and heavenly words, why should he remain silent about the miracles of Christ the Savior. Cur ego taceam clara miracula salutiferi Christi. And so the poet makes this propositio, saying what he will not sing and what he will not silence. We cannot fail to notice the poet's personal mark, reinforced by the use of the personal pronoun, cur ego. It is true that it follows on from the first verse of the Aeneid, Arma virumque cano, with all its assertive value of this first person. But it is nonetheless a continuity in the rupture. Sedulius affirms what he will not sing and what he will not silence. Furthermore, in ancient epic poetry, the narrative is told almost exclusively in the third person. The reader or the listener witnesses the events, the actions performed by the hero or by gods, described by the poet who remains almost hidden in the discourse. In the Aeneid, first person, Cano, appears in the first verse and then practically disappears. In Paschale Carmen, Sedulius is not hidden. He has a goal, and it is not merely to celebrate by narrating the deeds of a hero who may even become a ethical model for the reader. Sedulius' discourse reveals a religious motivation and conviction. The conviction that the narrative content is true, or it is the truth itself, and the goal of not to leave the reader indifferent. This fact marks the identity of the poetic subject, who signals his presence and strives to connect with the reader, addressing him directly, mentes ut vertite. When they have traces of the poetic subject that we were not accustomed to in ancient epic, we then have traces of the poetic subject that we were not accustomed to in ancient epic poetry. Cur ego taceam, cum postim loqui manifesta, et delectet facere dominum tonantem. Why should I remain silent when I can speak of things that are manifest, true, evident, when it gives me joy to confess the thundering Lord? This thundering Lord is not Jupiter, of course, but Christ. And Sedulius continues with a profession of faith in Christ, entirely God. His power is one with that of the Creator Father. Una est cum patre potestas, par splendor, communis apex aequus honor, virtus eadem. Celebrating this Dominus is the way to salvation. Haec est via salutis, haec firmos ad dona gradus Paschale aducit. Epic poetry becomes, to the poet, a form of worship and a path to redemption. The language, however, at every turn evokes expressions from Virgil. Haec via salutis, for instance, refers the reader to the words that Sibyl addressed to Aeneas. And this path to salvation is not only for the poet, but also for the reader or listener of the poem. The propositio is renewed. Haec mihi Carmen erit. And until the end of the verses that we can consider the proposition, the poet appeals to the reader. Mentes ut vertite, and apply this remedy, avivite anc opem, to the wounded hearts that a deadly evil dominates. Medullis laesis quos letale malum serpit. May they abandon the idolatry and errors of Athens, the labyrinths of Daedalus and deceptions that lead to Tartarus, the deserts and the sterility of vain religion, to find the fertile fields, the ever-flowing woods, the divine waters. The subject matter that Sedulius celebrates is therefore the path and remedy of salvation for himself and for the reader who follows him. Following verses, which we can understand as an invocatio, continue in an extensive apostrophe to God the Father, omnipotens aeterne Deus. The poet praises and exalts the creative act of nature and human beings and the work of redemption, the bread and blood that were the remedy for humanity deceived by the poison of the serpent and the forbidden fruit. He also praises the regeneration of humanity in the flood, universal baptism, and then makes the invocation petition. Note, this petition does not explicitly ask for help in composing the epic. This is a vital request, the petition of the poet. The poet asks God to open the way to the city of salvation, pande viam in urbem salutarum, through the narrow path, angusto calle, to grant him light for his feet, da lucernam lucere pedibus meis, so that he may reach the fold of the good shepherd. With God as his guide, the path is not difficult. Te duce difficilis non est via. The signs of divine powers remain forever. Signa virtutum nullis temporibus abolenda sunt, and are immense. Sedulius dares to narrate some of them. But who would be capable of doing so, even if having 100 tongues and an iron voice? To the classic invocatio, Sedulius had the grandeur of epic material, the miracles of Christ, signa virtutum, using the images with which St. Paul praises charity. After this propositio and invocatio, Sedulius deals with what he had proposed. The miracula Christi, narratio begins. However, in the first book, these miracles are actually episodes from the Old Testament, signs of divine power, signa virtutum, which, through symbolic and metaphorical language, the poet presents as prefigurations of Christ. One of these wonders, for example, the birth of Isaac in the old age of Abraham and Sarah, will be the occasion for interpreting the substitution of Isaac by a lamb in Abraham's sacrifice as an announcement of Christ. Isaac prefigures the meek lamb, Pius Agnus, who will die for humanity, ocumberet pro humana gente. In this case, the exegesis is explicit. Isaac docet ventura, teaches future things, that through the blood of Christ, a lamb would die. Sanguine Christi ocumberet annus. But in other cases, this exegesis is only hinted at through symbolic language. Christ, the hero of the poem, is always present, even in the first book that deals with episodes from the Old Testament, because the purpose of reading it is to prepare his arrival. Thus, in the second book, the poet begins with a narrative closer to a biographical account. But it should be noted that the narrative returns to Genesis and the fall of Adam and Eve, which dragged all of humanity down with them. It is because of this fall and in order to redeem humanity that Mary, born of Eve's lineage, will atone for her crime. Virginis antiquae facinus nova virgo piaret. And with the birth of Christ, Christo nascente, man can be born again. Renasci possit homo. Mary and Christ, two figures that are difficult to dissociate in the human redemption that God, the Father, wanted to offer to man after the fall of Adam and Eve. An angel announced to an untouched virgin what was going to happen. She believed. The creator of all things submitted himself to the law of birth. Rerum creatur nascendi sub lege fuit. And the virgin rejoiced at being the mother of her creator. Virgo gaudet paritura suum parentem. In these verses, Sedulius expresses the first Marian dogma, the Catholic dogma of divine motherhood, defined in 431 in the Council of Ephesus. Still at the beginning of Book 2, we cannot fail to comment on the verses that refer to the birth of Christ and that would be incorporated into the Marian liturgy of the Catholic Church. Salve Sancta Parens, enixa puerpera regem, qui celum terramque tene per secula. Sorry, the pronounce because it's an in Ecclesiastic Latin. The verses that follow immediately place the reader in the Virgilian setting and in Jupiter's prophecy about Aeneas in Book 1. Hail, Holy Mother, who gave birth to the King who made heaven and earth, whose name dominates everything in an eternal cycle, whose empire remains without end. Imperium sine fine manet, evoking Imperium sine fine dedi. The passage imitates Jupiter's words to the mother of the hero, to Venus, and is one of those that most contributes to presentation of Christ as a new and superior Aeneas who has just been born. Without going into great detail, Sedulius refers to the figures of the shepherds, the visit of the Magi, the baptism of Jesus, temptations in the desert, calling of disciples, and ends Book 2, the second book, with instructions of life, of Christian life. And these instructions are a long paraphrase or commentary on what has become established as the Christian prayer of the Our Father or the Lord's Prayer, in about 70 verses, lines. Books 3 and 4, the central core of the epic, are devoted to the miracles of Christ. Roger Green provides us with a list indicating the verses that correspond to each miracle, numbering around 40. The first is the miracle at the wedding at Cana and the transformation of water into wine, and the last is the resurrection of Lazarus. The latter, immediately followed by the entry into Jerusalem for the Passover feast, in some way heralds the passion and resurrection of Christ, which will constitute the epic material and the content of the Book 5, the last one. Also filled with wonders, with miracle, this book resumes the continuous narrative of the biographical record. The Passover supper, the agony in Gethsemane, the trial before Caiaphas, the trial before Pilate, crucifixion, death, resurrection, and finally, Jesus' ascension into heaven. This is perhaps the most significant book. I'm sorry, I won't present you with detail because there was no time, but perhaps this is the most significant book to Sedulius, if we consider the title. 7. Let's rest, okay. Perhaps it's the most significant book because if we consider the title, because the whole Book 5 is Paschale. Sedulius seems determined to demonstrate the truth of the Christian charisma, the resurrection of Christ, in several details. After referring to several appearances of the risen one, the poem ends with Jesus' ascension into heaven before his disciples, Testes. Before that, however, he addresses them with words of sending and mission, insisting on peace. I distraí-me aqui. Pacem omnes inquit abete, pacem ferte meam, pacem portate quietam, pacem per populos dispergite. Be at peace, take my peace, carry peace, spread peace. I command you to summon all peoples from every corner of the world, so that they may be washed in waters, in fonte lavari. Leave them in peace and command them to take it to the whole world, to summon the peoples from all corners and wash them in its waters, in waters of the baptism. And having said these words, I ubi dicta, Christ went to Bethany, and before those who deserve to contemplate his triumph, rose into the air, habit in horas aeterias. And so ends the epic. How? Paraphrasing the conclusion of John's Gospel. Of all that they saw, the witnesses of Christ wrote only a part. For if they wanted to write all the deeds of Jesus, the whole world would not be enough to contain all the books, so great would they be. And with this epilogue, Sedulius refers the reader back to the beginning of the poem and to the invocatio, in which he himself states that he dares to mention only a few of the signs of divine power. Although rewriting the deeds of Christ in epic form, Sedulius recognizes that no human poetry can encompass the greatness of this epic subject matter. But why then does he embark on this undertaking and not remain silent about the Clara Miracula Christi? I'm sorry, I don't read all. Why then does he embark on this undertaking and not remain silent about the Clara Miracula Christi? And why does he choose the epic genre? A register that he achieves not only by imitating the hexameter, the language, the poetic images, the formulas, and the literary conventions of epic genre, but also by subtly constructing an implicit parallel between the figure of Aeneas and that of Jesus Christ, between the eternal Rome and the eternal kingdom of Christ. The imitation of the classical epic is not just a formal imitation that adds aesthetic value to the message. In the process of literary creation of the Christian epic that rewrites the Gospels, emulatio weighs more heavily than imitatio. The poet wants to surpass the ancient epic that he knows well and that he admires, so he cannot ignore it. He must resort to it in his poetic discourse and assume its imitation. Evidently, all this is done to affirm a message that is very different from and incompatible with the ancient religious content. One of Sedulius' intentions is undoubtedly to debate or combat the Arian heresy, although it had already been condemned, and to prove that Christ is truly God and truly man. Furthermore, I believe that Sedulius was convinced that for a learned audience educated in the school of ancient authors, the epic formulation of the Gospels was a more effective way of expressing the message of Christianity and its fundamental charisma. Evidently, the different nature of the message and the subject matter affects literary conventions of the epic genre. And the most relevant of all concerns the main hero, Christ, who is a man, but who is God. If in Virgil's epic the father of the gods, Jupiter, is not even above the fates, in the Paschale Carmen, the hero, who is God himself, can, for example, calm the storm himself. Neptune is not needed to calm the storm. Jesus Christ, in, I quote, exurgens dominus validis mites quereventis impera. Finally, I believe that we cannot overlook the identity of the believing poet, who, driven by his commitment to convey a religious message, intervenes more frequently in the narrative discourse and even more frequently makes the exegesis of the biblical intertext. This condition of the exegetes poet reveals yet another dimension of the hero, a dimension that completes the triangle of the religio, or relationship between God and man. Christ, the hero of Paschale Carmen, is man, he is also God, and he is the mediating victim of the sacrifice in which God restores the relationship between man and God broken by the original sin. Sedulius decided to rewrite the Christian message, the gospel, as an epic, knowing that this undertaking will result in a completely different epic, greatly different from classical one. The hero and the epic subject are substantially different. He also knew that in this time and cultural background, the epic form was perhaps the most effective way to provide to that learned audience with a poem of high literary value, so that he could celebrate the most exalted subject matter of his own religious faith, the deeds of Christ. Thank you, and I'm sorry, my terrible English.
Thank you very much, Professor Miranda URBANO. Now, our final presentation by Professor Paula. Professor Paula is full professor of Portuguese literature here at the University of Coimbra, but she is widely known internationally as a specialist on José Saramago, upon LOURENÇO, other very important contemporary Portuguese writers, widely known in Portugal and Brazil and the wider Portuguese-speaking community. And we're jumping now to practically to the present day, after having heard about things from past centuries. So it's very fitting, I think, that we should end our 3 days of thinking about these subjects with José Saramago and with Portuguese, because Juventus, of which we spoke today, was Spanish. So finally, we have a Portuguese author. So that's good.
Thank you very much, Frederico, for your kind words, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here and be able to share some thoughts on José Saramago's Gospel according to Jesus Christ. I'll be the main focus will be the reception of the novel, some of the most controversial themes like Mary's non-virginity, the romantic relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the crucifixion of Jesus, which went unnoticed by critics, and the crucifixion of Joseph, and finally, where does the truth lie? These are my 3 epigraphs. Truth cannot be more than a face overlaid on infinite varying masks. Good and evil do not exist in themselves. Each is simply the absence of the other. And finally, it would be more comfortable to believe in God, but I chose the place of discomfort. In the first volume of Cadernos Lanzarote, the diary, entry dated December 5, 1993, José Saramago notes, and I quote, that the novel and the novelist have no choice but to return to the 3 or 4 great human questions, perhaps only 2, life and death, in order to try to find out not where we come from and where we are going, but simply who we are. Although we absolutely agree with these words, we cannot fail to recognize that in the works of this avowedly communist and atheist author, these 2 major issues are inevitably and inextricably framed by religious considerations that make him one of the most controversial voices in Portuguese literature. Thus, the most diverse subversive exercises, such as the peculiar use of punctuation or the deviant use of genre and period codes, are combined with a no less peculiar reuse of secular history and, in this case, religious history. Therefore, in opposition to the trend in 19th century historical novels, which discreetly and respectfully reproduced, and I quote Saramago again, reproduced known facts point by point, with fiction merely serving to ensure unassailable fidelity, José Saramago boldly dares to weigh historical data, which is no more than sufficient, into a fictional fabric that will remain predominant. These 2 vast words, worlds, the world of historical truths and the world of fictional truths, at first glance irreconcilable, are then harmonized in the narrative instance, and I quoted Saramago. They are harmonized, but without undergoing a pedagogically nostalgic recovery of the revisited past. The lost time of our history becomes the raw material for a game in which, through irony, parody, and sometimes metafiction, canonically transmitted meanings implode. Hence, given the impossibility of reconstructing the past, what the writer does is to correct it, but he does so not in the sense of correcting the facts of history, I'm quoting Saramago again, for that could never be the task of a novelist, but rather in the sense that he introduces small cartridges into it that explode what until then seemed indisputable. In other words, by replacing what was with what could have been. If the replacement of what was by what could have been did not cause controversy in historical novels such as Memorial do Convento, Baltasar em Bolimunda, História do Cerco de Lisboa, History of the Siege of Lisbon, or even Cain, also a deeply subversive religious reworking of biblical episodes, albeit with a comical tone and therefore possibly more acceptable, the same did not happen with the novel we are discussing in this brief text, The Gospel According to Jesus Christ, published in November 13, 1991. And here you have several covers, several editions of the Gospel and the Evangelho, announced as a work in which God is the villain, or in my case, the target is God. The Gospel did not initially provoke any noteworthy public reactions from the Church, which had recently recognized in May 1991, at the first extraordinary assembly of European bishops, the need and urgency for, and I quote, a new evangelization. Perhaps for this reason, Saramago was confident that his book would pass unscathed, although he admitted to some isolated reactions, but it didn't. Despite the cordial debate between the author and the Dominican theologian Friar Bento Domingos that took place on November 28 at the Capela do Rato, 2 weeks after the novel's publication, despite the absolution of the author by Friar Bento, or despite his thoughts on the importance of the book, and I quote, to debating the implications of the church's sacrificial power throughout history and to awakening the theological slumber that exists in this country, the controversy became intense and reached the point where the book was banned from the list of books nominated for the European Literary Prize, on the ground that it attacked the principles of the religious heritage of Christians, not just the Church. Regarding the ban, which, among other reasons, will lead him to exile in Lanzarote, Saramago will say that, and I quote, "It is the victory of prepotence, the triumph of the arrogance of those who have the power to make decisions in fields they are not called upon. It is a return to Inquisition." In the meantime, despite being generally acclaimed by the academia, the novel nevertheless continued to generate great waves of protest from other individuals in civil and religious circles, both nationally and internationally, some of whom clearly admitted that they had not read the novel. Father Leonel Oliveira, in an article published in November 7 in Voz Portugalenses, a weekly newspaper of the Diocese of Porto, rejoices in the fact that reading interviews with the author has spared him, and I quote, "the painful reading of a book announced and publicized by its own author." Pedro Lopes Quinteiro, in December 1991, draws attention to the indecent and theological nonsense of the author. In January 1992, Vasco Polido Valente wrote in K magazine, that, and I quote, behind the novel lie the scenes of a repentant communist. In March, Vital Capil, in 1992, March 1992, underlined that, among several other reasons, and I quote, this is a book to be read only by those with a higher education and a well-formed conscience, so that they can correct the errors and distortions contained in the book. It was published in Arras. This is another one. In June, the virtual heir to the Portuguese crown, Dom Duarte Pio de Bragança, at a dinner in support, a dinner that happened on June 9, a dinner of support of Sousa Lara, the person responsible for excluding the gospel from the list of candidates for the aforementioned European Literary Prize, classifies the book as shit, while admitting, however, that he has not read it. With regard to the situation beyond Portuguese borders, echoing some national commands, we transcribe an excerpt from a long letter dated March 10, 1997, and sent by a certain Brazilian Mary, which Saramago includes in volume 5 of Cadernos Lanzarote, improving, as he writes, and I quote, improving the spelling and adjusting the verb tenses, but respecting the punctuation, which is much more extravagant than mine, than his. I quote, I am not writing to you with courtesy and respect for someone who does not deserve it, for you are nothing but a heretic, an atheist, and a wicked man. You have written nothing but heresy, debauchery, and nonsense, for as everyone said, all Portuguese people are stupid. You have proven this with your pen, and yet you have the audacity to think that you were called to tell the story of Jesus Christ, you who are not even worthy to pronounce his name, only if you were called by Satan, your friend. You did not respect the dogmas of faith. You did not respect the Blessed Virgin. Let's start with the beginning of your book, Gospel According to Jesus Christ. It's simply that your brain doesn't work very well, and yet you presume to know more than the evangelists who lived at that time and were present at everything. You poor thing, you're nothing more than a mere illiterate who should be selling vegetables and drinks in the bars of Lisbon. You mock the Immaculate Virgin, saying that Jesus Christ was born to Joseph, and what is more, that she had 9 children. Does it hurt you to know that Jesus was exclusively the Son of God, and by the work and grace of the Holy Spirit? Saint Joseph, simply an adoptive father. Your heart cannot bear this. You want to change something that is 3,000 years old, and you write so many barbarities in your book. For what? You will not be able to change the truth. You have the audacity to portray Jesus Christ as a rebel who abandons his home and runs away to conquer the world and prostitute himself, even going so far as to receive money from a prostitute. At the very least, that's what you should have done as a boy. As if that weren't enough, you further tarnish Christ's life by writing in your filthy book that you lived with Mary Magdalene. Were you there? Did you see him in her bed, kissing and engaging in lewd behavior with a prostitute? End of quote. In addition to these respects, the letter is much longer, of course. In addition to these aspects, among others that we will not have the opportunity to develop, this Brazilian Maria, who, in all fairness, knows the sacred texts and, unlike others, has read Saramago's book, briefly refers to the episode of the massacre of the innocents and Joseph's possible guilt, or to the dysphoric characterization of the Virgin Mary. We naturally accept the subversions pointed out. However, bearing in mind the scope of Saramago's doctrine, the writer's understanding of how we would revisit the past, which we have noted above, and recalling with Elizabeth Wesley the flawed, selective, partial, and fragmented nature of the historical grand narrative, we cannot agree with the tone and the color of these readers' vehement assessment, and also that of other readers or non-readers of the book in question. In this sense, in the hundreds of pages that make up the novel, we read nothing more then a proposal in the form of a tribute as plausible and legitimate as the existing ones to the life of a martyr who was and wanted to be, above all, a man, and therefore imperfectly perfect. As imperfectly perfect as other characters who orbit around him, some of whom we are introduced to in the opening pages, in a kind of chapter 0 that some readers will accept as bland and neutral in terms of the inscription of Saramago's counter-ideology. However, this neutrality or disobedience to the canonical description of the death of the man who will become the main character of the book is merely apparent. It exists only on the surface of an ekphrasis or a painting made of words after the cover of one of the editions of the novel on the right, which makes us see another way of reading the crucifixion of Christ, circa 1498, the 8th of the 12 woodcuts that Albrecht Dürer conceived to illustrate the Great Passion, precisely the painting that, in close articulation with the parodic recovery of Luke's Gospel, not by chance, we believe, ends the novel, but I'll get there at the end. The absence of neutrality, another way of saying that it is impossible for the narrator or the author not to take an ideological stance on the subject matter, is illustrated, for example, by the comments made about the two thieves, or by the few words used to rescue Joseph of Arimathea from the infamy of, and I quote, of having given Jesus vinegar out of spite and contempt when he asked for water, end of quote. Or, above all, the way in which the narrator sees, the way in which the narrator sees and interprets Dürer's representation of Mary of Magdala in an undeniably positive and also affectionate and respectful portrayal of the love that in the novel we know she will consummate with Jesus, an assumption which, together with the non-immaculate conception of Mary, gave rise to the most incisive criticism. What the narrative as a whole offers us, therefore, is a process of humanizing characters such as Jesus and Mary, his mother, both of whom are presented by tradition in an almost supernatural dimension. At the same time, we will witness interesting processes of redemption of characters such as Mary, now Mary Magdalene, who is of profound importance in this narrative, as is the case of women in other narratives by José Saramago. So this Mary Magdalena is responsible for the reconstruction of the man different from the one perpetuated by religious history, a man capable of human love and of no less human error. For this reason, and remembering once again that the past comes to us partially, in none of the situations involving these two women do we read any disrespect or religious outrage. On the contrary, at least if we put our preconceptions aside, if we dare to leave the surface of this new gospel and delve into its less obvious layers, we will illustrate what we have just said by focusing on two of the most controversial moments in which we highlight the beauty and affection of the language used by the narrator, orchestrated in almost musical cadences. The first example concerns the conception of Jesus. In a clear opposition to what is attested in the canonical sacred texts, Matthew or Luke, or what is certified by the apocryphal Gospel, the history of Joseph the Carpenter, translated by FREDERICO LOURENÇO, but in close affinity with the Gospel of Philip, Saramago's Jesus is the result not of the intervention of the divine Holy Spirit, but of a natural and human sexual relationship between Mary and Joseph. The narrator does so not merely alluding to this relationship, but boldly describes it in relatively minute detail. And so we know that, and I quote, Joseph furtively approached Mary and slowly drew back the sheet. That she began tugging at the hem of her tunic, and no sooner had she pulled it up as far as the navel, while opening her legs, than he was on top of her, his tunic hitched up to the waist. We also know that God, who is omnipresent, was there, but pure spirit as he is, was unable to see how Joseph's skin came into contact with that of Mary, how his flesh penetrated hers as had been ordained, and perhaps he was not even there when the holy seed of Joseph spilled into the precious womb of Mary, both sacrosanct, being the fount and chalice of life. For in truth, there are things God himself does not understand, even though he created them. Out in the yard, there are a mistake there. Out in the yard, God could neither hear the anguished gasp which escaped Joseph's lips as he experienced an orgasm, nor the gentle moan Mary was unable to suppress. The second example concerning Jesus' initiation into the art of love is once again supported by the Gospel of Philip, where in some pages Mary Magdalene is not only referred to as the Lord's companion, but also as the one the Savior loved more than all the disciples and kissed her often on the mouth. We quote the excerpt. There is something erased there because there is clear wrong translation because we need to read open as it is in the Portuguese version and not close. So that's the reason why close is erased or underlined. And I corrected it. I corrected Giovanni Pontiero. Mary reappeared completely naked. Lying there as she had left him, Jesus too was naked. He thought to himself, this must be right, and to cover the body she herself had stripped might have given offense. Mary lingered by the side of the bed, gazed on him with an expression at once passionate and tender, and told him, "You are so handsome, but to be perfect, you must open and not close your eyes." Jesus hesitantly opened his eyes, then closed them, and in a daze opened them again. And at that moment he understood the real meaning of King Solomon's words. The joints of your thighs are like jewels. Your navel is like a round globe filled with scented wine. Your belly is like a heap of wheat set about with lilies. Your breasts are like two young roes that are the twins of a gazelle. But he understood them much better and forevermore when Mary lay down beside him and taking his hands into hers, drew them to her and guided them slowly over her entire body, her hair, face, neck, shoulders, breasts, which he gently squeezed, her belly, navel, pubic hairs, the curve of her smooth thighs, and as he moved his hands, she kept on repeating in a low whisper, "Come, discover my body." Jesus looked at his hands clasped in Mary's, wishing he could have them free to explore every part of her body, but she went on holding and guiding them as she repeated over and over again, "Come, discover my body, discover my body." Jesus was breathing fast, but for one moment he thought he was going to suffocate when her hands, the left one on his forehead, the right one on his ankles, began caressing him slowly until they met in the middle, where they paused for a second before slowly repeating the same movement all over again. In the case of Jesus and his narrative journey, undertaken under the watchful eye of a malevolent and controlling God, we also emphasize the narrator's respect and affection, although in this case, we cannot fail to point out the difference we read or we feel in terms of the narrative rhythm. Reverential, calm, and strolling when Jesus is still a man and nothing more than that. Faster from the moment the miracle worker is added to the man. Even so, and bearing in mind that this condition, like others, is imposed on him, various manifestations of melancholic solidarity interwoven with incisive and ironic comments do not go unnoticed, as in the episode of the crucifixion. We recall that the canonical Gospels clearly and circumstantially point both to the idea of quiet acceptance of a death that Jesus knew was prematurely destined for him, and to the fact that he had full knowledge of the future apocalypses of humanity, according to Matthew and Mark. The reconstructed image of Jesus, and also the one of his death, therefore necessarily implies an aura of intrinsic heroism, also of a supernatural nature, and a complicit, voluntary, and ever-resigned relationship with the wishes of the divine entity. For his glorification and in his name we die, according to John, and in this way the sins of humanity are redeemed. This is not the case, or not quite the case, for the character recreated by José Saramago, and consequently for the image of Jesus and his death that results from it. In fact, in the pages of this fifth gospel, the figure of Jesus is recreated according to a line of human fears and of no less human apprehensions, to which are added the mystical and mythical circumstances of his birth and his human love for Mary Magdalene. Therefore, in what we consider to be one of the pivotal moments of the novel, the long episode in which, together with God and also with the shepherd, the devil, he finally learns who he is and what his purpose is. Jesus assumes himself to be a man who, as such, expects to die. However, the future that God has in store for him is very, very different. The role to be played in the divine plan is that of a martyr. And as befits a martyr, and I quote, death should be painful and, if possible, ignominious, so that believers may be moved to greater fervor and devotion. Death will then be, as tradition dictates, on the cross. The fundamental issue is that this death now appears as an absolute imposition by a selfish God who, having chosen someone else's son and taken him as his own, does not allow breaches of contract, does not allow him to live like any other man. No matter how much he desires and begs, Jesus cannot escape this death. The words, the pronouns in ReD, in the English translation, they are written with capital letters, and it does not happen like that in the Portuguese version. Let us start from the beginning and go back to the moment I revealed that you are in my power. For until you humbly and peacefully submit to this truth, you will be wasting your time and mine. Let's start again. Then, agreed Jesus. But you warned, I refuse to work any more miracles, and without miracles, your plans will come to nothing. A mere shower from heaven, incapable of satisfying any real thirst. You would be right if it were in your power to work or not to work the miracles. Don't I have the power? What an idea. I work miracles both great and small, naturally in your presence, so that you may reap the benefits on my behalf. You're superstitious at heart and believe the miracle worker has to be at the patient's bedside for the miracle to take place. For even supposing you were to persist in opposing my will, to go into the world and deny that you are the Son of God, I should cause so many miracles to happen wherever you pass that you would be obliged to accept the gratitude of those thanking you and thereby thanking me. So there's no way out, none whatsoever. And don't play the restive lamb that resists being taken to be sacrificed, becomes agitated and bleeds in the most heart-rending manner, for your destiny is filled. The sacrificial sword waits you. Am I that lamb? You are the Lamb of God, my son. My son, which God himself will carry to the altar we are preparing here. Faced with his death, therefore, Jesus feels like a condemned man and not like someone who, with resignation but of his own free will, accepts in the name of God and humanity a predetermined fate, a destiny of death that above all serves God in the struggle with other gods, a struggle in which no means will be spared to achieve the desired ends of absolute supremacy over man, of course, a supremacy that is nonetheless refused by Jesus, by the narrator, and by the author. Thus, in the final lines, in yet another subversively parodic line, Jesus, crucified, calls out to the open sky where God could be seen smiling. Men, forgive him, for he knows not what he has done. Thus answering the question raised in Muriel do Convento about, and I quote, who will pardon or punish God? It is worth quoting the lines that follow Jesus' request to men, the very last ones of the novel. Then he began expiring in the midst of a dream. He found himself back in Nazareth and could see his father shrugging his shoulders and also smiling as he told him, just as I cannot ask you all the questions, neither can you give me all the answers. There was still some life in him when he felt a sponge soaked in water and vinegar moisten his lips. And looking down, he noticed the man walking away with a bucket and ReD over his shoulder. But what he could not see, lying on the ground, was a black ball into which his blood was dripping. It is not, therefore, going back to the crucifixion, it is not, therefore, in this fifth gospel, as recorded in the canonical gospel of Luke, a matter of asking forgiveness from the Father for those who had crucified him. Much less, it is a matter of delivering his spirit into his hands. On the contrary, in a clear assumption of the selfish and malevolent role of a God who, as a sacrificer, forces him to die, it's a matter of begging humans to forgive the actions of the divine, thus fully assuming the supremacy of the former, the man, over the latter, God. After all, as he had already said in Memorial do Convento, and I quote, it is the human will that sustains the stars. It is the human will that God breathes. And it is easy to see that if there are no men, the world comes to a standstill. And it is precisely from the perspective of human understanding of situations, and also within the framework of José Saramago's value system, that we now recall the episode relating to Joseph's death. I need 5 more minutes, okay?
3 minutes.
Oh, okay. I'm begging for 2 more. We recall the episode relating to Joseph's death. Unlike the canonical texts, which are silent on what may have happened, leaving us only to guess at his appearance before the crucifixion, Saramago's novel fills in the gaps and recounts the small details that are undoubtedly now of interest to history and to his history. The detailed account of Joseph's death by crucifixion is therefore not merely an ideologically innocuous narrative device. The truth is that this character could only have had this fate, this punishment, if you will, not because he had transgressed divine law, not because he had violated Christian morality, according to what is mentioned in the Bible, but because in the author's eyes, Joseph committed a much worse sin. He offended the moral standard defined by human solidarity, caring only about saving his son and doing nothing to prevent the death of the other children of Bethlehem. We might argue that this was, despite the consequences, an understandable human reaction. Perhaps it was, but it would have been no less humane and humanitarian to warn the people of Herod's order. The narrator's accusation and judgment are in fact confirmed, validated by 2 of the characters in the story, the angel and Jesus himself. The former clearly classifies Joseph's behavior as a crime, stating that, and I quote, the carpenter could have done something. He could have warned the villagers that the soldiers were coming to kill their children when there was still time for parents to gather them up and escape. The second, who inherits the distressing dream of his father Joseph, contrary to the current attribution of blame to Herod's soldiers, including his mother, sadly and melancholically, but vehemently cries that Father murdered the children of Bethlehem. Father was to blame. Joseph, son of Heli, was responsible, for he knew those children were about to be killed, did not warn their parents. It is time to conclude. But we do so with awareness that there is much, much more to be said. Regarding what has been presented, some will say that these and other things we read in Saramago's novel are lies. To those people, we would ask, why are there lies? After all, as Elizabeth Vesely wrote, history, the writing of history, is biased and selective because, first of all, in what she calls accidental causes, we have to make do with whatever relics happen to have survived the wear and tear of time. The second cause is epistemological. Our insights into the past are determined by the type of questions we put to the source materials. Accordingly, and I'm quoting again, the historian only selects as noteworthy those historical data that fit into the picture which he has in mind. The third cause of selectivity in historiography is political, because historiography can only concern itself with those individuals and collectivities who have made the historical record. Underlying that the past almost always reaches us in textual form, what guarantees us the impossibility of José Saramago's version? What guarantees us the inadmissibility of the small details he introduces that deviate from a truth considered unassailable? It is important to remember, as Lydia Jorge said, that history, which Almeida Garrett through Carlos called foolish, and which Esther Queiroz predicted will always be a great fantasy, history, we were saying, reads the past and said, this is how the past was. Literature expresses a desire, proposes a change to what happened, an alternative. After all, returning to the epigraph with which we opened our text, truth cannot be more than a face overlaid on infinite varying masks. Thank you. Já pôs na reciclagem?
You'd like to sit here, so we can have a few more minutes for the questions. And Lautaro, I've already confirmed with Lautaro that our session is going to be very informal, because what we mainly want to do is to thank Eulalia and Pedro for having been absolutely amazing the whole time.
And to Guillermo and Smile for
Absolutely.
For resisting the 3 days of the conference.
Yeah.
So let's have one or two questions and a little
If there
bit
are
of discussion, if there are any. This time,
If there are any, yes.
if there are. Please, would you like to?
Yeah, let's feel comfortable now.
Yes, you were standing up, we were sitting down, you were standing up. So I think we'll all agree that the most eye-opening moment was to learn about the Gospel according to José Saramago.
It was different.
Very, very different from the Christos Paschon and from Sedulius's Paschale Carmen. So while you're thinking of asking a question or two, I'd just like to ask Carlota, and since Rodrigo is also here, do you have a favorite poem between the two? So Juvencus, the Evangeliorum Libri, and Sedulius, comparing the two, do you have a favorite?
Yes. Sedulius. Well, I already read some excerpts of Juventus Evangelion Libri Quattuor, but I prefer Sedulius because I think the poet is more present and is more passionate. I don't know if you have the same opinion.
Yeah.
The poet is more present and is more certain.
Yeah, well, Juventus also appears during the narrative. Maybe you're right. Well, I don't read the Sedulius for I don't know why, but when I read Sedulius, I would prefer the poem as a literary text.
Object. That's
Literary
But it's more beautiful, Frederico, using that.
my term. I've rediscovered the concept of beauty. Okay, fine. Lautaro, please.
Thank you. I have a question, well, or a comment or a reflection on the last paper. It was very interesting, first of all, I didn't read that yet, but I will now do that. But I was wondering, I mean, you've made an effort to establish all the possible parallels, of course, with the ideas that are appearing in the book, in a way that's, every point Saramago deals with, in a way or in another, is in the tradition. But then I began to think whether this is at all important. I mean, he's working with the tradition, he's working with the reception of certain ideas within the Christian thought, and he explores the limits of the possible interpretations of different facts. And I was immediately thinking, of course, when listening to the paper, thinking on Borges' short story, 3 Versions of Judas, which he wrote, I think, in the 50s or 60s. But in any case, in 1983, Gospel of Judas was discovered and was finally published in 2007 by National Geographic. So when this happened, everyone was very interested to see interpreted the Gospel of Judas in the line of Borges' interpretation. And why? Because he had explored the possible limits of dispersion of the interpretation of the figure of Judas. If the kerygma of the Passion and Resurrection was God's plan, obviously Judas was an instrument of God in order to enact the kerygma. This he explores in 3 different versions because I don't know if you read it, some of you probably did, but this theologian in Sweden, I think, a Swedish theologian who was Curtis and has to correct it in order to avoid the Inquisition, let's say, so he makes 3 versions. Well, after almost 2 decades of analysis of this Gospel of Judas, it turns out that the interpretation of the text is not at all what Borges was imagining, and the whole scholarship applied to interpret the text, but the opposite. So my question then would be, to what extent is it necessary that there is an historical text, which, as you very well said, is part of the narrative, the imagination. Yesterday, Alberto was talking about the memo history, a wishful thinking, you could say, a reconstruction of the past. To what extent is it necessary, to reconstruct the possible sources of Saramago? And then my question: do you know whether he knew?
Well, I have a theory. Well, to start with, Saramago knew the Gospels very, very well. Otherwise, he couldn't have written the Gospel according to Jesus Christ or Cain, which is also made out of biblical episodes. I think he writes these historical novels based on religious history according to a certain recipe that he has for his historical novels. The real history, the so-called true history that you cannot deny in an absolute way, his imagination, and then the non-official sources. And when he combines these 3 ingredients, his main goal is to call to the stage, to the main part of the stage, to call to the main part of the narrative, either those who have been ignored by official history, or replacing, correcting some parts of the past in order to show that man is the only person responsible for life, for the destiny, the power of man. I think it is a way of putting the power of man over the power of God. And the power of man is, for me, the main theme of Saramago's work. Not love, not history, whatever, but the power of man. In one way or another, all the narratives go in this way, show the power of man over the divine. And reconstructing Jesus, as he does in this novel, in a parallel with the Gospels, because he cannot deny what the Gospels say. They can subvert, he can subvert, but he cannot deny. I think he wants precisely to show this, that what matters is man, not God. He was an atheist, so this is his ideology, or his counter-ideology. So this is what I think. And he does this not in a pamphletary way. Mm-hmm. He does not want to be a pamphletary man, but simply because he thinks that he thought that the novel was the grounds to build a way to make human more conscious about being more solidarian and humane. This is what I think.
Thank you. Thank you. So, more questions? Would anyone like to? I think everybody's heard enough. So, Lautaro, will you come over here for our closing session, just to, you can join us.
Please.
You sit here.
Oh, please, thanks.
And
thank you. So I begin? Yeah. So, we arrived at the third day of our long conference. We realized probably that 3 days is a very long, at least those who have been, from beginning to end. But it was a very, very fruitful and very interesting conference, I think, which covered, by means of these 5 panels, lots of different angles of the theme we were dealing with, or actually 2 themes, right? Religious diversity and globalization. And we did that, approaching it from the legal angles. No, first of all, the theoretical or institutional angles of the different partners of the Erasmus Mundus. Then, by means of the legal angles, the religious angles, social media angle. And finally, we closed it, fortunately. Of course, what is our speciality, namely, the diversity of early Christianity. So I think it was very interesting from the early morning till now to, see all these fantastic aspects and how diversity actually belongs to the genetic code of Christianity and of Western thoughts. It's a pity that Gabriel is not here with his chair of the origins of Western thoughts, but you have here in Coimbra a very nice course.
Yes, which Margarida started. Yes. Mm-hmm.
The exact name is also
Origins of Western Thought. So, Origins do pensamento ocidental.
And I had the pleasure and the honor of teaching one of the courses there. So again, I would like, therefore, to thank a lot to all the participants, all the efforts, and not only the intellectual efforts of writing papers and presenting them, but also the organizational efforts of all of us, beginning with all the chairs, of course, and the participants, and of course, Eulalia and Pedro, which were crucial elements in this construction, because all of this. Thank you very much. And at least for my part, before maybe you would close some words, but at least from my part, remembering you that that our plan is to publish a book including all the papers that were presented at this conference. So we will approach you shortly, to communicate a path with a deadline, the norms, where it's going to be published, etc. So please, it will be fantastic if you could present a written version of what you presented. And I think the order which we gave to this conference a very nice order also for us. I don't know what you think.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'll only say one or two final concluding things, and one is to remember what Professor Delphine Liang said at the opening session, our vice rector, and he reminded us that this faculty was originally a faculty of theology, which a lot of people don't know, but the Faculdade de Letras was many, many years ago the faculty of theology of the University of Coimbra, and it then evolved to be something else. And the very interesting development which we've seen in the last few years, and Lautaro has been instrumental in bringing that to the fore and in creating an international environment for this to go forward, is the interest that many colleagues here have shown in religious studies and in bringing together the study of literature, the study of religious texts in a context where we obviously respect everybody's opinion, because not all of us are atheists like José Saramago, and not all of us are at the opposite spectrum. So there's a lot of diversity here. And I think that a faculty like ours is a very, very promising space for coming forward with the whole reflection on religious diversity, literature and religion, religious texts and history. So I think we have all the necessary elements and ingredients, and we only need you and more international.
Well, but Frederico, me and all those of us who collaborate in the Erasmus Mundus, I think this is a very interesting step. Not only, I mean, of course, for Coimbra, for the development, the recovery of a certain tradition which has been always here, but also, you know, the ReD Global, I mean, it's a way of combining these different approaches. The Protestants, you know, in Northern Europe, the Catholic here, although the Jesuitic part of history in bringing to the fore the first globalized, let's say, approach to religion and to spreading, you know, and the respect of this diversity. But, you know, and facilitating this forum, we managed to create thanks to that. And I think this conference is a very good example of this. I mean, because we managed not only to discuss the colleagues working in this particular international master, but also all the other non-academic partners, NGOs, foundations who are collaborating with us and helping us now and in the years to come in the construction of this dialogue. Right? So thank you very much again. Andrea, I have to say something which because Andrea had to leave before. She's also one of the organizers. She told me we will, in the coming days, write, you know, a sort of conclusion for this a closing moment that you were looking for, of course. But yeah, most of the people is already away. So thank you very much again for the opportunity, of course, that you gave me here to.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.